You really think she understands a single word we're saying? Ethan Caldwell didn't bother lowering his voice. The question floated across the table with a smug grin attached to it, and within seconds, a few executives chuckled into their crystal glasses. The laughter wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the quietest laughter carried the sharpest edge. The rooftop restaurant overlooking downtown San Francisco glowed beneath warm amber lights. 40 stories above the city, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline painted with millions of dollars in ambition. Luxury cars lined the private entrance below. Investors, founders, and executives filled the room above. Every seat at the long walnut table represented power. Every handshake represented influence. And every signature planned for tonight carried the potential to move hundreds of millions of dollars. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, the 39-year-old billionaire CEO of Caldwell Dynamics. His company had transformed medical technology across the country. Business magazines called him visionary. Financial networks called him unstoppable. Most people in the room simply called him successful. Ethan wore confidence the way some men wore expensive watches. Effortlessly. Naturally. Like he had forgotten there was ever a time he didn't possess it. Beside him sat members of his executive team, each eager to laugh a little louder whenever he spoke. Across from them sat international investors, attorneys, and consultants reviewing documents tied to an $800 million expansion deal stretching from California to the Middle East. The atmosphere should have been professional. Instead, something uglier had begun to settle beneath the polished surface. A few feet away, moving quietly between tables, was Naomi Brooks, 27 years old, black, soft-spoken, wearing a pressed black uniform and carrying a silver tray balanced perfectly in one hand. Most people never looked twice at her. They noticed the wine. They noticed the service. They noticed whether their glass was empty. But they rarely noticed her. Naomi had become familiar with that kind of invisibility. It followed her. Through luxury hotels, private events, and exclusive restaurants where powerful people often mistook silence for simplicity. She moved gracefully through the room, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and maintaining the calm professionalism expected inside one of the city's most expensive dining establishments. To everyone watching, she was simply another waitress working another shift. To Ethan and several members of his team, she was barely part of the room at all. One executive leaned toward Ethan and spoke quietly in Arabic. A smirk appeared immediately. Another executive answered. More laughter followed. Naomi approached the table carrying a bottle of sparkling water. Ethan glanced briefly in her direction before turning back to his colleagues. Then he said something in Arabic that caused several men around him to grin. One investor covered his mouth to hide a laugh. Another shook his head. Naomi remained expressionless as she poured the water. Her movements never changed. Her posture never shifted. Her eyes remained focused on her work. Ethan noticed her silence and interpreted it exactly the way he wanted. See, he said, still speaking in Arabic. Not even a reaction. The men around him nodded. The city lights reflected against the glass behind them like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the bay. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Expensive conversations filled every corner of the room. Yet none of those sounds could quite drown out the growing arrogance gathering around that table. Because Ethan Caldwell believed he understood exactly who Naomi Brooks was. A waitress. Background noise. Someone who existed on the edge of important conversations rather than inside them. The kind of person powerful men stopped noticing after 5 seconds. And that belief made him comfortable. Far too comfortable. Naomi stepped away from the table and continued serving nearby guests. Her expression remained calm, professional, unreadable. But what Ethan Caldwell failed to realize was that silence and ignorance were not the same thing. Not even close. And before the night was over, the entire room would discover just how dangerous that misunderstanding could become. Naomi moved through the restaurant as if nothing had happened. That was what years of experience had taught her. Some people carried authority, some carried wealth, and some carried assumptions. The trick was learning which one weighed the most. Around her, conversations flowed as freely as the wine. Investors discussed expansion strategies. Attorneys reviewed final revisions. Market forecasts drifted from one end of the table to the other. $800 million sat quietly inside leather folders and polished presentations. Yet the most revealing conversation in the room was happening between the people who believed nobody could understand them. Ethan leaned back comfortably in his chair. The confidence in his posture had grown stronger. Every unanswered remark reinforced the story he had already written in his mind. Across the table, a representative from Dubai reviewed several pages of documentation while speaking softly with an interpreter. Ethan barely paid attention. His focus remained on entertaining the executives seated beside him. Another comment in Arabic. Another round of smiles. Another assumption disguised as humor. Naomi passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water. She heard every word, every joke, every careless observation. She understood the subtle differences in dialect. She recognized the regional expressions. She even caught the grammatical mistakes one executive kept making while trying to impress the others. Yet she said nothing. Not because she lacked confidence, because timing mattered. And sometimes silence revealed more about people than arguments ever could. Near the kitchen entrance, another server approached her. "You okay?" the woman asked quietly. Naomi offered a small smile. "I am fine." It was the same answer she always gave. The same answer she had given through long shifts, difficult customers, and countless moments of being underestimated. She returned to the dining area and continued her work. Above the city, the night deepened. Lights shimmered across the bay like scattered stars. The restaurant's glass walls reflected power from every direction. Success, prestige, influence. The room was full of people who had spent their lives learning how to be noticed. Naomi had spent hers learning how to observe. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. Ethan lifted his glass and continued speaking with the men beside him. "The funny thing," he said in Arabic, "is that people always want to seem smarter than they are." A few executives laughed immediately. One of them glanced toward Naomi. "Perhaps she thinks we are discussing the menu." More laughter followed. Not cruel enough to make headlines. Not obvious enough to draw confrontation. Just the kind of arrogance that grows when people stop expecting consequences. Naomi heard every word while replacing a centerpiece candle that had nearly burned out. The small flame flickered before growing steady again. For a brief moment, she watched it. A tiny light surrounded by expensive darkness. Then she returned to work. At the far end of the room, a legal consultant suddenly requested an updated contract package. Several assistants hurried to organize documents. The atmosphere shifted slightly. The social portion of the evening was ending. Business was beginning, and business carried real stakes. Ethan adjusted his jacket and prepared for the next phase of negotiations. He felt completely in control. The deal looked secure. The investors appeared satisfied. His team remained loyal. From his perspective, the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. What he did not know was that the quiet waitress moving through the room had already noticed something unusual. A phrase repeated twice in one document. A translation choice that felt strangely inconsistent. A detail small enough for most people to ignore. But Naomi did not ignore details. She never had. As the first contract folders opened across the table, her eyes settled briefly on a page left partially exposed beside an investor's chair. She continued walking without stopping. Her expression never changed. Yet something in her attention sharpened. Because while everyone else in the room was focused on money, Naomi had just noticed something that could change the entire night. Naomi slowed her pace for the first time that evening. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to glance once more toward the open contract resting beside the investor's chair. Most people would have missed it. The page was filled with legal language, financial projections, and international compliance terms dense enough to make even experienced executives lose focus. But Naomi had spent years around words. Words mattered. One misplaced word could change a conversation. One mistranslated word could change a contract. One assumption could change a life. She carried a tray toward the service station while the image of the document remained fixed in her mind. The Arabic phrase she had seen was unusual, not incorrect, not obvious, just different. Different enough to make her wonder why it appeared where it did. Around her, the negotiations continued gaining momentum. Advisors reviewed spreadsheets. Consultants exchanged notes. Investors leaned closer to one another. $800 million was not the kind of number people discussed casually. Yet Naomi had learned something important about wealth. The larger the number became, the more dangerous small mistakes could be. Near the kitchen entrance, she set down the tray and reached for a pitcher of water. Her manager crossed paths with her. "Big night," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "Looks that way. Hopefully they sign before midnight." Naomi smiled politely. "Hopefully." The manager hurried away without noticing the thoughtful expression lingering behind her eyes. Naomi had never planned to spend her life serving tables. Years earlier, she had imagined something different. During college, she studied international communications and linguistics. Languages fascinated her. Every language felt like a doorway into another world. While other students spent weekends at parties, Naomi spent hers listening to recordings, memorizing vocabulary, and studying regional dialects. Arabic became one of her favorites. Not because it was easy, because it was difficult, because every phrase carried history. Every expression carried meaning beyond the words themselves. Her professors often joked that Naomi noticed details other people walked right past. Tonight, that habit refused to leave her alone. Back in the dining room, Ethan Caldwell stood beside the projection screen reviewing the final presentation. His confidence filled the room. He moved comfortably between investors and executives, shaking hands and answering questions with the ease of someone accustomed to winning. The audience responded exactly as expected. Nods, smiles, agreement. Everything appeared perfect. Yet perfection often created its own blind spots. Ethan's attention remained fixed on the people he considered important. The investors, the attorneys, the executives, the decision-makers. He never once looked toward Naomi. Not really. To him, she remained part of the furniture. Helpful, invisible, irrelevant. One investor raised a question about international distribution rights. An attorney immediately opened a contract binder. Several pages turned. Numbers were reviewed. Deadlines were discussed. Naomi happened to pass nearby carrying fresh glasses. That was when she heard it. A sentence read aloud from the Arabic section of the agreement. Her heartbeat slowed. Not faster, slower. The way it always did whenever something required complete concentration. There it was again. The same phrase. The same wording. The same subtle inconsistency. She kept walking. Professional. Silent. Calm. Yet now she was certain. The translation did not match the intent of the English version. Not completely. Not accurately. The difference seemed small. A few words at most. But legal agreements were not built on intentions. They were built on exact language. Across the room, applause suddenly broke out as one portion of the presentation concluded. Glasses clinked together. Smiles widened. Ethan accepted congratulations before the deal was even finalized. Success already felt inevitable. Naomi looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. The city sparkled beneath the darkness. Somewhere below, traffic moved through the streets like streams of red and white light. Above it all sat a room filled with powerful people celebrating a future they believed was secure. And sitting quietly among hundreds of pages of paperwork was a mistake none of them had noticed. A mistake that could transform an $800 million opportunity into a very expensive problem. Naomi tightened her grip on the tray and watched as the final contract folders began moving toward the signature table. The energy inside the restaurant shifted the moment the contracts reached the signature table. Conversations became quieter. Smiles became more deliberate. The casual atmosphere that had filled the evening slowly gave way to something far more serious. This was no longer dinner. This was decision time. $800 million rested inside a collection of documents spread across polished walnut wood. Investors adjusted their chairs. Attorneys organized notes. Executive assistants prepared final copies. Every movement carried purpose. Every glance carried expectation. Ethan Caldwell stood near the head of the table with the confidence of a man who had already begun imagining tomorrow's headlines. The expansion would place Caldwell Dynamics in multiple new markets across the Middle East. Industry analysts were already predicting record growth. Board members expected celebration. Shareholders expected results. And Ethan expected victory. That expectation had followed him for most of his life. Success rarely arrived by accident. Ethan had spent years building his company from a small startup into one of the most influential medical technology firms in America. He understood negotiations. He understood strategy. He understood leverage. But like many successful people, he had gradually developed a dangerous habit. He trusted his strengths so completely that he sometimes overlooked his weaknesses. Tonight, that weakness wore the disguise of certainty. Across the room, Naomi continued serving guests while carefully observing the activity around the signature table. The translation issue remained fixed in her thoughts. She replayed the wording repeatedly. Every time she examined it, the concern grew stronger. The problem was not dramatic enough to attract immediate attention. That was exactly what made it dangerous. Large mistakes were easy to spot. Small mistakes often survived because nobody bothered looking twice. One attorney began reviewing final language, with representatives from both sides. Pages turned. Pens clicked. Laptops glowed beneath the warm lighting. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls. Everything appeared flawless. Yet Naomi knew appearances could be deceiving. Near the center of the table, an executive from Ethan's team made another comment in Arabic. Several colleagues laughed again. The confidence in their voices had grown throughout the evening. Why would it not? They believed they controlled the room. They believed they understood every variable. They believed the quiet waitress moving between tables remained completely unaware of their conversations. Ethan smiled as another joke circulated among the group. The laughter felt effortless now, comfortable, familiar, the kind of confidence people develop when they stop questioning themselves. Naomi passed nearby carrying fresh coffee service. Once again, fragments of Arabic conversation reached her ears. Once again, nobody seemed concerned about who might understand. She remained silent. But the silence felt different now. Earlier it had been patience. Now it was calculation. Because Naomi faced a decision of her own. She could ignore what she had noticed. After all, she was not part of the negotiation team. She was not one of the attorneys. She was not one of the executives earning six-figure salaries to review contracts. Most people in her position would simply continue working and leave the responsibility to someone else. Yet something inside her refused to look away. Her father used to tell her that knowledge carried responsibility. If you saw a problem and understood the consequences, pretending not to see it did not make the problem disappear. Those words returned to her now with surprising clarity. At the signature table, the first set of documents moved forward. Investors prepared their pens. Cameras from the company's media team quietly positioned themselves near the back of the room. Celebration waited just beyond the next few signatures. Naomi looked toward the contract one more time. The wording stood out immediately. Clear. Unmistakable. She no longer suspected there was an error. She knew it. And as the first investor lowered his pen toward the page, Naomi realized that within the next few minutes, the entire future of the deal could be shaped by a mistake that nobody else in the room had even noticed. The investor's pen hovered inches above the paper. Around the table, anticipation settled like electricity before a storm. Camera lenses focused. Executives straightened their jackets. Assistants prepared congratulatory messages that would be scheduled the moment the signatures were complete. Ethan Caldwell glanced around the room and smiled. Everything had fallen into place exactly as planned. Years of preparation had led to this moment. The expansion would redefine his company. The numbers were enormous. The opportunity even larger. Across the room, Naomi stood near the service station holding a silver coffee pot. Her eyes remained fixed on the contract. The phrase stared back at her from memory. Not a typo. Not a formatting issue. A translation error. One that changed the meaning of an entire section governing distribution authority in several international markets. The English version granted limited rights. The Arabic version granted significantly broader authority. If signed as written, both parties could walk away believing they had agreed to completely different terms. The realization tightened in her chest. She looked toward the attorneys. None of them appeared concerned. She looked toward the translators. They seemed satisfied. She looked toward Ethan. He was already celebrating. Then she heard another comment from the executive group. One of Ethan's colleagues glanced toward her while speaking in Arabic. Maybe she thinks all these papers are menus. Several men laughed. Ethan smirked and answered in the same language. At least menus would be useful to her. More laughter followed. Quiet. Polished. Expensive. The kind that never expected consequences. Naomi remained still. She could have ignored it. She could have walked away. Nobody expected her opinion. Nobody had invited her into the conversation. In fact, several people in the room had spent the entire evening making it clear they believe she did not belong anywhere near it. The safest decision was silence. But safety and responsibility were not always the same thing. At the signature table, the investor lowered his pen. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. One signature. That was all it would take. One signature, and the mistake would become a legal reality. She took a breath. Then another. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. Jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across polished wood. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked successful. Everything looked moments away from becoming a disaster. Before she could second-guess herself, Naomi stepped forward. Not dramatically, not loudly, simply one step closer to the table. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, respectful. The room froze. Conversation stopped. Several heads turned immediately. Ethan looked at her with visible irritation. The interruption had arrived at the worst possible moment. "We are in the middle of something," he said. Naomi nodded politely. "I understand, sir." A few executives exchanged amused looks. One attorney frowned. Another investor leaned back curiously. Ethan folded his arms. "Then what is it?" Naomi hesitated for only a second. Every eye in the room now rested on her. For the first time all evening, she was no longer invisible. "I believe there may be a problem with the Arabic translation in the contract." Silence. Complete silence. The kind that swallows an entire room. Several executives blinked. One actually laughed under his breath. Ethan stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. "The Arabic translation?" His tone carried open disbelief. "And how exactly would you know that?" The question hung in the air. Investors looked from Ethan to Naomi. Attorneys paused over their notes. The translator seated near the contract slowly raised his eyes. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Naomi met Ethan's gaze calmly. Then she spoke a sentence in fluent Arabic. Clear, precise, effortless. The words flowed through the room like a sudden change in gravity. The laughter disappeared instantly. Smiles vanished. Chairs stopped moving. Even the translator's eyes widened. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell looked at Naomi Brooks as though he were seeing her for the very first time. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than the $800 million agreement sitting on the table. Ethan Caldwell stared at Naomi as though the rules of the evening had suddenly changed without his permission. The executives who had spent hours joking in Arabic now looked at one another with visible uncertainty. One investor slowly lowered his pen. Another leaned forward in his chair. The translator seated near the contract remained completely still. Naomi did not appear nervous. She did not appear angry. She simply stood there holding an empty serving tray, waiting. Ethan recovered first. "You speak Arabic?" The question sounded smaller than he intended. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Another silence followed. The translator finally cleared his throat. "Her pronunciation is excellent." Several heads turned toward him immediately. He adjusted his glasses. Native level, or very close to it. The atmosphere shifted again. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of shift that happens when certainty begins to crack. Ethan glanced toward the contract, then back toward Naomi. "You mentioned a problem." Naomi nodded once more. "I believe there is a discrepancy between the English and Arabic versions of the distribution rights section." One attorney frowned. "What kind of discrepancy?" Naomi looked toward the open document. "The English version grants limited regional authority. The Arabic version appears to grant broader operational authority beyond the specified markets." The attorney immediately reached for the contract. Pages turned rapidly. Another attorney joined him. The translator leaned closer. Suddenly, everyone who had ignored Naomi minutes earlier became interested in every word she said. The room that had celebrated early now felt cautious, focused, alert. Ethan remained standing at the head of the table while legal teams reviewed the section. His confidence had not disappeared, but something else had arrived. Doubt. 5 minutes earlier, he believed the evening was finished. Now he was no longer sure. Across the skyline, city lights reflected. Against the glass walls like thousands of distant stars. The jazz music still played softly in the background, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the contract. Finally, one attorney looked up. His expression had changed completely. "She is right." The words landed with surprising force. Another attorney checked the passage himself. "She is absolutely right." The translator nodded slowly. "The wording creates a much broader interpretation than the English version." A murmur spread across the room. Investors exchanged concerned looks. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan's jaw tightened. The mistake was real. Not theoretical. Not hypothetical. real. Had the agreement been signed, both parties could have walked away with entirely different expectations. Months later, the misunderstanding might have exploded into legal disputes, financial losses, and public embarrassment. One investor looked directly at Naomi. "How did you catch that?" Naomi offered a modest smile. "I noticed the phrase earlier while serving the table." The answer somehow made the room even quieter. Because there was no dramatic explanation, no secret meeting, no special invitation. She noticed it because she was paying attention, while others assumed, while others celebrated, while others laughed. Ethan looked down at the contract and then toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, he remembered every joke spoken in Arabic, every careless remark, every assumption disguised as confidence. And standing a few feet away was the woman who had heard all of it. The woman who had just saved the most important deal of his career. The room no longer looked at Naomi Brooks the same way. Minutes earlier, she had been part of the background. Now she stood at the center of a conversation nobody expected her to enter. Attorneys continued reviewing the corrected language, while investors quietly discussed what might have happened if the agreement had been signed without anyone noticing the discrepancy. The answer was becoming increasingly clear. The mistake could have created months of confusion, legal disputes, and financial uncertainty. What should have been a celebration had nearly become a very expensive lesson. Ethan Caldwell remained silent longer than anyone expected. For a man known for having an answer to everything, silence felt unusual. He watched the attorneys compare both versions of the contract side by side. Each confirmation strengthened the same uncomfortable reality. Naomi had been right. Not partially right. Completely right. One of the international investors finally looked toward her and smiled. "You may have saved everyone at this table a great deal of trouble." Several others nodded in agreement. Naomi shifted slightly, still holding the serving tray she had carried throughout the evening. "I was just paying attention," she said. The simplicity of the answer drew another round of silence. Because attention was supposed to be the responsibility of the experts, the executives, the consultants, the attorneys. Yet the person who noticed the problem had been the woman refilling water glasses. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A senior attorney closed the contract folder and looked directly at Ethan. "We need to revise the language before anyone signs anything." Ethan nodded. "Do it." His voice remained steady, but something had changed. The confidence was still there. The authority was still there. Yet humility had quietly entered the room for the first time all evening. Near the far end of the table, one executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He remembered the jokes, the comments, the assumptions spoken freely in Arabic. Judging by the expressions around him, he was not the only one. The translator finally stood and approached Naomi. "Where did you learn Arabic?" he asked. Several people immediately listened. Naomi smiled politely. "My father taught languages at a community college. I grew up around books, recordings, and conversations from all over the world." The translator nodded with obvious respect. "That explains the fluency." Another investor joined the conversation. "How many languages do you speak?" Naomi paused for a moment. Enough to stay curious. A few people laughed softly. Not the dismissive laughter from earlier. This sounded different. Warmer. Genuine. Respectful. For the first time all evening, people were listening to her instead of talking around her. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. The more he learned, the worse he felt about the assumptions he had made. He had spent hours judging someone he knew absolutely nothing about. Not because of facts. Because of appearances. Because of position. Because he had convinced himself he understood the entire room, when in reality he had barely noticed one of the most capable people in it. Outside, the San Francisco skyline continued to glow beneath the night sky. Inside, revised contracts moved between attorneys and translators. The deal was still alive. Stronger now, perhaps. Built on clearer terms and fewer hidden risks. But another shift had occurred that could not be measured in dollars. The balance of respect inside the room had changed. And Ethan Caldwell was beginning to realize that the most important lesson of the evening had nothing to do with business at all. The revised contracts moved through the room with a level of caution that had been absent earlier in the evening. Every page was reviewed again. Every translation was checked twice. Every assumption was questioned. The celebration that once seemed inevitable had been replaced by something far more valuable. Attention. Ethan Caldwell remained near the head of the table, but he was no longer the most confident person in the room. Confidence built his empire. Tonight, humility was teaching him something confidence never could. Across the table, investors continued speaking quietly among themselves. More than once, Naomi's name entered the conversation. The woman who had arrived as a server had become the unexpected reason the agreement was still standing. One investor from Dubai leaned toward another and shook his head in disbelief. Imagine if she had stayed silent. The answer did not need to be spoken. Everyone understood it. Millions of dollars in future complications had likely been avoided because one person chose to pay attention when everyone else assumed someone else already had. Near the service station, Naomi returned to her responsibilities. She refilled glasses, cleared empty plates, replaced coffee cups, the same tasks she had performed all evening. Yet the room reacted differently now. People thanked her. They made eye contact. They asked questions. It was remarkable how quickly respect appeared once people understood value. Ethan noticed that too. In many ways, that realization bothered him most. Not because the others were wrong now, because they had been wrong before, including him. He remembered every joke spoken in Arabic, every careless remark, every moment he had treated Naomi as though she existed outside the boundaries of importance. The memory sat heavily in his mind. An hour later, the corrected documents were finally approved. Signatures followed, one by one, carefully, deliberately. This time nobody rushed. When the final signature appeared on the last page, applause filled the room. Genuine applause. The deal was complete. $800 million. New markets, new partnerships, years of growth ahead. Cameras captured the moment. Investors shook hands. Attorneys relaxed for the first time all night. Yet, even during the celebration, Ethan found himself looking toward Naomi. Not the contract, not the investors, her. Because deep down he knew something uncomfortable. The biggest reason for tonight's success had never appeared on the guest list. As the event slowly began winding down, Ethan crossed the room. Several executives noticed and fell silent. Naomi was organizing glassware near the service station when he approached. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The sounds of celebration continued behind them. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him calmly. Ethan took a breath. "I made assumptions about you tonight." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from a man who rarely admitted mistakes. More than assumptions, honestly. Naomi listened without interrupting. "And if you had decided not to say anything, this evening could have ended very differently." The billionaire who had spent the night believing he understood everyone in the room now stood face to face with the person he had understood the least. Naomi offered a small smile. Not triumphant, not bitter, simply kind. Ethan found that somehow made the lesson even harder to ignore. Because grace often reveals mistakes more clearly than embarrassment ever can. Around them, the city lights continued shining beyond the glass walls. The deal was done. The crisis was over. But the most important transformation of the night had nothing to do with contracts, investors, or money. It was happening quietly inside a man who was finally beginning to understand the difference between seeing someone and truly noticing them. The crowd gradually began to leave. Investors headed toward private elevators. Attorneys packed away folders that only hours earlier had carried the weight of uncertainty. Assistants gathered laptops and presentation materials. The rooftop restaurant slowly transformed from a center of high-stakes negotiations back into a place of quiet elegance. Outside, San Francisco shimmered beneath the night sky. Inside, a lesson lingered long after the signatures had dried. Naomi continued helping close out the evening. She collected empty glasses, organized service trays, and completed the same tasks she performed after every event. There were no cameras following her, no reporters asking questions. No dramatic celebration waiting at the end of the night. In many ways, nothing about her routine had changed. Yet everything felt different. Earlier, people had looked past her. Now they stopped to thank her. Several investors shook her hand before leaving. One attorney asked for her contact information. Another quietly told her that she had probably saved everyone months of future complications. Naomi accepted the compliments with grace, but she never appeared interested in becoming the center of attention. That was never what motivated her. Near midnight, Ethan Caldwell stood alone beside the glass wall overlooking the city. The room had finally grown quiet enough for reflection. For years, he had believed success came from seeing opportunities others missed. Tonight had exposed a blind spot he never knew existed. He had spent an entire evening measuring people by titles, positions, and assumptions. The person who ultimately protected the deal had none of the credentials he expected and all of the qualities he failed to recognize. When he saw Naomi preparing to leave, he walked over one final time. The confidence that once defined every interaction had softened into something more genuine. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Naomi nodded. "Of course." Ethan glanced briefly toward the skyline before speaking. "When you heard everything earlier, why did you still help?" The question carried more weight than the words themselves. Both of them understood what he meant. Naomi could have remained silent. She could have ignored the mistake. She could have allowed the consequences to unfold. Instead, she chose differently. Naomi considered the question for a moment. Then she smiled. "Because the contract was wrong." Ethan gave a small laugh. "That is all. That is enough." The answer stayed with him. Not revenge. Not pride. Not recognition. Simply doing the right thing because it was the right thing. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "I have spent years thinking leadership was about having the answers." Naomi listened quietly. "Tonight reminded me that sometimes leadership starts with listening." For a moment, neither spoke. The city lights reflected across the glass between them. Thousands of people moved through the streets below. Most would never know what happened inside this room. Most would never hear about the mistake, the translation, or the woman who prevented a costly disaster. Yet some stories matter whether they become headlines or not. Ethan extended his hand. Naomi shook it. "Thank you," he said. This time the words carried no formality, no obligation, just sincerity. Naomi picked up her bag and headed toward the employee exit. She did not leave with a promotion. She did not leave with a fortune. She left with something far more difficult to earn: respect. Ethan watched her disappear beyond the doorway before turning back toward the skyline. The deal had been saved. The investors were satisfied. The company would move forward. But the most valuable thing he gained that night could not be measured in dollars. It was the understanding that intelligence does not announce itself. Dignity does not demand attention. And the people most often overlooked are sometimes the very ones holding the wisdom everyone else needs. The city continued shining beneath the darkness. And somewhere beyond the glass, life moved forward exactly as it always does. But for one billionaire and one waitress, neither would ever see the world quite the same way again.